You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your five-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome back, guests. It's good to see you, Geoff.
Good to see you, Kate.
Mike's away. You know how he loves the sound effects for the podcast. So I think he's in search of the perfect little desk bell for the hotel that he can use. But he'll join us again at the Strategy Suite later in the podcast, where we'll look at some of the issues dogging the governing New Democrats, review some interesting nominations by the NDP and the Greens, canvass a few more of those awkward vote split ridings, and dive into the latest poll from Leger. But first, our guest today is a writer whose work holds a special place on the shelves of the hotel library, journalist and novelist John Vaillant. Since he published The Golden Spruce in 2005, a distinctively BC story about the destruction of a unique and sacred tree in Haida Gwaii, BC author John Vaillant has built an international reputation as a nonfiction writer and novelist. His bestseller, Fire Weather, The Making of a Beast, about the Fort McMurray blaze of 2016, was published last year to wide acclaim and became a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. A combination of on-the-ground gumshoe journalism and meticulous popular science, Fire Weather helps us to understand the new and uncharted territory we're entering as climate change amplifies natural disaster, but is built around the very human, personal experiences of the people of Fort McMurray. We're delighted and honored to have John Vaillant join us at Hotel Pacifico today. Welcome, John.
Hello, Kate. Hi, Geoff. So good to be with you.
Thanks for coming.
Can we start? I mean, the timing to have you on, I think, is really great because you had the op-ed in the Globe and Mail yesterday. And I have to say about the fires, we had 2 fires in Vancouver, including a 6-story building in Dunbar. And I was reading your book actually as these fires broke out and thinking a bit. I want to start us with an important part of the first part of the book is you examining fire. Lots has been written about fire, and I'm often struck by how much writers spend sort of in the humility of how powerful fire is. But I think for you, there was this other layer too of understanding a different element to the chemistry and the physics of fire that really played out. We saw play out in, live in Vancouver last week on Tuesday. So you could tell us a little bit about that shift in thinking and how you've understood fire and how it informed your reaction to those fires.
Well, it's seeing these new fires and how they behave. And we've had just a raft of them over the past 10 years, these really destructive urban fires that often start as wildfires and then sweep into cities and wreak absolute havoc and often, lethal mayhem. Really got me thinking about its behavior and what it is. And, honestly, and I'm embarrassed to say this, I don't think I ever studied chemistry ever in high school or elementary school or university. And so I'm really coming at this from a very rudimentary layperson place. And so I really had to educate myself into, what is fire? And we think of it, this red, orange flickering thing, but it's really it's, technically it's a chemical reaction, which is not helpful, right? That doesn't make anything clear to me. And so I really had to spend a lot of time with the energy and what I came to understand as the appetites of fire. And because it's driven by oxygen, as we are, I found that a kind of useful common ground or baseline to start at. What do humans do? We need to breathe all the time. We are saving ourselves from suffocation 20,000 times a day by breathing. We have no idea really that we're doing this, but we do it all the time. And, if I invite readers and listeners to just don't inhale for 30 seconds and just watch what your body does and watch where your thoughts go, and you'll realize how urgent it is, but you'll also get an insight, I think, into fire behavior. And if you watch an active fire, it's a very urgent, active, kind of aggressive, aspirational energy. And that's a lot like us. And I think it's one reason our lives, our behaviors and activities are so closely bound up in each other. We live in a fire-powered civilization, and we don't see it because we have brilliant engineers, and the petroleum industry has done a very good job of kind of keeping a lid on the explosiveness of this substance that is ubiquitous. So fire is almost our kindred, and I feel like, when it comes to fire, we're in this sort of hold my beer kind of dynamic. And each one of us encourages and enables more and more outrageous behaviors than the other. And some of these, are amazing. We've got rockets going into space and we're flying around in airplanes and, we're doing these, truly wondrous things. But we're also, superheating the planet and enabling fire to burn on Earth more intensely than it ever has in human history.
Well, I think at one point you call us all casual wizards in the way we work with fire.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things, and definitely what I was thinking of when I was hearing about this fire, was I think there's a shift where, and I would say I have studied chemistry and I still would think of fire as consuming, as a right? But it's really more of an explosion. It's more of a combustion, right? And that's sort of what can be so, and when I don't want to get too far on the science, but what the sort of pervasiveness of all these hydrocarbons in our environment, we're kindling that explosion, making it bigger, and the fires are becoming harder to control. Is that?
Absolutely. And you want to jump in there?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
What I was to me, the most useful thing that I learned about fire is, look, I've got a fireplace at home. I put a log in there, it'll burn eventually. But what the fire is reacting to is not the solid object. It doesn't burn the solid object. Why fire is hot is to heat up potential hydrocarbons enough so that they vaporize.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if it's a plastic chair or a running shoe or a gas can or an oak log. It needs to heat that thing up enough until it becomes a gas, until it becomes a vapor, like something you and I can breathe. Basically, that's what fire needs too. That's what fire relates to. And that's what the heat is for. And so anytime you see a fire burning, you kind of have to imagine this cloud of flammable gases around the object that's burning. And, watching that incredible fire at the corner of 41st and I think it was Collingwood, you couldn't believe what was in there because it looked like a gas station was on fire. But actually, it was, a 6-story condo under construction. But there's a lot of volatile glues in chipboard and plywood. And I'm pretty sure that's a lot of what was reacting. There may have been some fuel cans there that blew up, but the bulk of that fire, I'm pretty sure, was just wood and chemicals.
When you wrote about Fort McMurray, did you think that a number of years later you'd see Fort McMurray evacuated a second time? You'd see Jasper on fire, that you'd see that fire in your own neighborhood. How do you respond to these changes? And when do you think most of us will become aware of what's so very present around us?
Well, Fort McMurray in 2016 was a signal moment, certainly for our hemisphere, I think, and certainly for our continent and country. Stephen Pine, one of probably the greatest living articulator and communicator for fire. He's a professor emeritus from, I think, ASU in Arizona. He's got a literal bookshelf of books on fire that he's written. He's very eloquent. He's a tireless historian. He's written a really good book about Canadian fire, among many other books. And that's when Fort McMurray burned, he coined the term the Pyrocene, that we are entering a new age of fire. And he called it the Pyrocene age. And that has stuck. And it was the Fort McMurray fire that inspired him to write that piece for Slate magazine. And I felt a sort of signal change also. And I don't have the expertise he has, or any climate scientist really, but you could just see the way that fire burned. The fact that the fire was in the city, not for a terrible 36 hours like most urban fires, but day after day and night after night, that it generated a 45,000 foot tall pyrocumulonimbus cloud that generated its own lightning, that started more fires 20 miles away in the desiccated boreal forest, and so it became this almost perpetual motion machine. And to see how it disrupted this incredibly potent, effective city that for the previous 150 years had basically been able to call the shots with nature however it wanted to. And literally in a matter of hours, this burgeoning, successful powerhouse of nearly 100,000 people was sent fleeing in what became the largest, most rapid evacuation due to fire in modern times. So that was just the speed of that turnabout, coupled with the fact that local lakes were still frozen. You know, we're in the subarctic in early spring. Local lakes are still frozen. There were car-sized blocks of ice on the Athabasca River. And yet it was that hot and that dry and that explosive. And that to me says, okay, if that can happen in the subarctic, what could happen in Vancouver? What could happen in San Francisco?
We'll talk a bit about that, because what you described in your piece was kind of mind-blowing for me, because normally we think of wildfire starting somewhere else and coming to where we are if we're very unlucky, and maybe we get evacuated. Usually we hear about this happening to people a long way away, but this was in a West Side neighborhood, and you described phenomena that I didn't think would be associated with a fire, even in a building of 6 stories.
I mean, it is spooky how hot and how intense fires get. That fire, my understanding, it's not official, but my understanding is it was started by the roofers who were using a torch to put on a torch on, you know, tar roof. Got away from them, but the temperatures achieved in there. I don't have the Celsius for you. Sorry, my American roots betray me here, but it was 1800 Fahrenheit inside there, melted the base of the crane so that this 50-ton crane fell over, you know, in Marvel movie fashion, right across 41st Avenue, crushing the house on the opposite side of the street. And it's still there. You know, it's a week later, that crane is still in the middle of the road. There's nobody, you know, that's 41st Avenue is a main thoroughfare. So I wouldn't have written, I spent 7 years on fire weather, and as I wrote along year after year, the fires got more intense. And so I had this vindication that I was onto something, you know, but at the same time, there was this worry, you know, was Fort McMurray an anomaly, or would there be much bigger fires that would make it irrelevant? But it was clear to me, and you know, especially when I looked into the climate science, that we have turned a corner. When you look at parts per million of CO2, of methane, of rising average temperatures, of fire behavior around the world intensifying. I mean, there are mass evacuations now, as you and I speak to each other, on the outskirts of Athens. Famous, legendary, historic towns like Marathon are being evacuated right now while we're talking to each other. And this is just one place. You know, I'm sure there are evacuations going on in Siberia right now, and parts of Latin America due to fire. So if not in the Northwest Territories, where massive fire again are burning as you and I speak to each other. So that was evident to me when I looked at what climate scientists were concerned about in 2016. So you know, it's horrible to be vindicated. I wouldn't call it a vindication. But I think most climate scientists have been dialed into this since at least 2000, that we're entering a more flammable scenario, and we're creating it and now exacerbating it.
So I did do the conversion real quick. The 1800 Fahrenheit converts to just shy of 1,000 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
And I stay here for a minute because I think the point of your op-ed is you come to a message for Ken Sim to say, you're not ready.
That's putting it mildly. And yeah.
Put it less mildly if you'd like. I mean, to tell me.
Yeah, no, I don't know if he's the man for this moment, I gotta say. And it would take an extraordinary person to be the person for this moment, because it really needs to be somebody who really takes climate more seriously than they do real estate development.
But from a fire standpoint, John, as I was saying earlier, like the Vancouver Fire Department is, I think, as big as all the other Metro Vancouver fire departments combined. It's a significant share of property taxes. So as a former civic politician, I just come, you know, you don't need to convince me, but I wonder, how does an elected official convince voters that they're not ready, and what would the program be in your mind they would put forward? I mean, you don't have to be in politics, but what would you say?
Yeah, no, I really, I mean, one reason I'm still talking about this book 14 months after it came out, is because fire is in our lives now in a way that it wasn't. And I feel real urgency about communicating that fact, partly because of the interviews I did with people who've been through devastating fire. You know, it is kind of soul destroying, and not to mention terrifying and dangerous and expensive, but it's traumatizing. And I really would love to be an agent for reducing that in the future. And so right now, and I talked about this with Sophie Louis on BC TV, Global TV, BC. We did an interview, and it's linked, you know, on my Twitter page to the article, and it's linked in the article. And we discussed the possibility of Vancouver burning, and it feels almost heretical and vaguely treasonous to talk that way. You know, how could you say such a terrible thing about such a beautiful city? Well, partly it's one way to show your love for the city, to be able to be openly afraid for what might happen to it. And this is a really flammable town that I live in, and that a couple of million of us live in. And I had thought, and I talked about this with Sophie, you know, I could imagine the fire starting in Pacific Spirit Park or Stanley Park, you know, and there's a lot of, especially in Stanley Park, a lot of dead trees. And a fire could really get going in there and then blow through the West End in devastating fashion. But I think we need at the highest level, so at the council level, at the fire department level, an open discussion around this can happen here. This is not just a Jasper problem. It's not just an Alberta problem. It's not just a rural problem. You know, Lytton and Vancouver have a lot more in common than they might want to admit to each other, especially on the Vancouver side. And so for me, my response, you know, once I started writing the book, was I have a garden hose that reaches to my roof, and I have a garden sprinkler ready to go to nail onto my roof peak to set up a sprinkler that will go back and forth across, you know, the entire roof and hit the roofs of my neighbors who are dangerously close to me. And that is part of the problem with these really thickly settled neighborhoods that many of us live in. Those narrow passageways between houses create chimneys when they're on fire. And so that accelerates the speed, and that goes back to this energizing quality of oxygen and fire. And it becomes really like a blast furnace. And there's, you know, barely 2 meters between me and my neighbors. And that is normal in a lot of Western Canadian thickly settled neighborhoods. And those, you know, our fates are all tied to each other in that way. So we have had a really powerful wake-up call last Tuesday. I wrote about it as vividly as I could. There's no hyperbole in that article. And even the chiefs say we got, you know, they're amazed that the two things amazed them. One, how their resources were maxed out by just those two fires, the one on the west side and the one in East Van that lit up in an uninhabited apartment building that had already been cited for fire violations numerous times. But those two events maxed out the available resources, and the chief herself saying, you know, we could have lost a lot more. Yeah. And we got to look at that a lot more, because that a lot more, that even more, as she said, is the rest of us. Well, and not just in Vancouver, but as I said, you know, in Lethbridge and Saskatoon and Rosedale, you know, in St. John's. That's the rest of us.
Well, I wonder if too, because I think I'm going to say Surrey, because I wonder if Mayor Brenda Locke actually saw some of what you've been saying, or maybe read your op-ed. She brought it up at council, right? And what was fascinating to me reading about Mayor Brenda Locke sort of suggesting, what can we do, asking city staff, like, what can we do to prevent brush fires? One of the things that was shocking out of that was, I think the data were like, there's like something like 100 brush fires in Surrey alone in a month. Like, you know, like that's like 100 close calls.
Yeah, I know.
That's like,
yes, exactly. And that's how we need to start. You're exactly right. That's how we need to start looking at it. And Canada has been ridiculously lucky. I mean, think how few fatalities we've had look at Paradise, look at Lahaina, look at Valparaiso, Chile, hundreds dead. And we lost 2 in Lytton, which is too many. And we've lost some firefighters, which is way too many, but we have not had a mass fatality. And look at the number of fires we've had. Look at the number of towns we've lost now. And we've gotten away. And I think that we can't take our luck for granted, and we have been lucky. And some of that has been quick responses by firefighters and civilians, but there's also a luck factor. There's a whole spectrum of events that we simply cannot control ever. And those have gone our way repeatedly, and our luck's going to run out.
What do you say to people, and you met many of them and included them very respectfully in the book in Fort McMurray, who are committed to producing oil from the oil sands, and there's some great stories about people, like I think one is a guy named Wayne McGraw, and there's others who are debating, do I fight the fire or do I escape on my Harley? And some of them barely get away on the Harley. How do you bridge that cognitive gap between people who are alive and anxious about alive to the concerns and anxious about climate change, and those who are very, very committed to the oil sands and to oil and gas production?
Well, I think we need to separate the job and the person doing the job from the industry that they're working in. And all of us work in one industry or another. And most of those industries are dependent on fossil fuels at this point in time. And people who work in logging, who work in fishing, who work in petroleum extraction are just on the kind of sharp edge of that wedge of the rest of our appetites. So to hold them to some different standard than the rest of us doesn't really seem reasonable. But, so where culpability lies is with the governments and the banks and the industry that are enabling and perpetrating, and in fact expanding, in the case of Canada, colossal harm to our environment and frankly to our future. It is understood the impact fossil fuels have on our climate and on the future health of every living being on Earth. And the fact that they, especially in Canada, are doubling down and expanding, it's really, to me, it's kind of like, well, we all know Dad's an alcoholic, but he insists on driving. And he's persuaded us that's the only way we can get to school. So we're going to just get in the car with him again, even though we're going to crash one of these days. And, look at Jasper, look at the incredible drought in Alberta right now. Who be interesting to have on this show is a forest hydrologist. Those are the people I'm interested in. Fire is so visible and charismatic and dramatic. What's happening quietly under the forest floor and in our aquifers and in our rivers is much more sinister and has much more grievous implications, grave implications for our future, because that's water. That is the basis of everything for us. Oxygen, we breathe, inhale 20,000 times a day, but we are 70% water. And without that, we are dead in the water, without the water. So that's what's going on in Alberta right now. This drought, this is not a seasonal drought. This is not, we're having a bad year. We're moving into an aridification of the entire province.
Well, picking up though, I mean, it's such an interesting, we all know Dad's an alcoholic. I have a strong reaction to that because I think on one level, it's like, I think broadly that's true, but we're also like, there's some of us who are more worried about his diabetes. There's within the electorate and how we understand this problem, I think, just some very different views of where this fits within the priorities. And I feel like you touched on that in a really interesting way, and how people reacted to the fire. Like there's this interesting relationship to big problems that seem like really hard to tackle. And there's a term, I think a Greek term, I believe you used, for like how that sort of pushes it down on the priority list because we feel overwhelmed. It defies the imagination to conceive. Can you explain that concept and then maybe how it plays into the politics of climate and wildfires?
Are you speaking of the Lucretius problem?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a useful lens. So Lucretius was a Roman poet and philosopher, lived a couple thousand years ago, and he made this observation about a kind of glitch in human perception, in which we tend to believe, at least at the active level, that the biggest of anything, the most severe of anything, is the one that we've seen with our own eyes. And so, a distillation of that is, the fool believes that the biggest mountain in the world is the biggest one that he's seen himself. And so I'm here with the Cypress, mountain outside, and but I've never seen the Himalayas, I've never seen the Rockies, so I can't imagine that there are bigger mountains. And likewise, I think that really is an issue. We've all seen a house fire, and we've seen it, surrounded by fire trucks and waters everywhere. And it's kind of scary, but it's super localized and very contained. And that's not what was going on at the corner of 41st and Collingwood. That was the video I saw. That was the biggest urban fire I've really ever seen that wasn't a skyscraper on fire. And this was a normal day. This was a normal summer day in Vancouver. It wasn't exceptionally hot. It wasn't exceptionally dry. We had that wonderful rain about 10 days ago. We had, we're having a great summer here. And yet this fire was so big, you could see it from the Gulf Islands across Georgia Strait. So, and so that is that sense that I already know how bad things can get. I already know what the worst version of this is, because I've seen it myself. I've seen a car accident, I've seen a house fire, and it may not even be conscious, but I think that has a sort of limiting factor on our response. And so we saw that, I think, in the response to the Fort McMurray fire, when all the data pointed to firestorm conditions coming into Fort McMurray on May 3rd, wildfire and urban fire responded to it as if it was, another really bad 1990s fire. We're going to make some fire breaks, and we're going to set up some sprinklers. These are all really sensible things to do. I'm not Monday morning quarterbacking here. What I'm saying, though, is that they responded in a way that was appropriate to things that had already happened, not to the idea of something bigger and more intense than you ever imagined. And that's we are limited by our imaginations. And that, like, what the investigation into 9/11, when the felling of the Twin Towers by those jets, the biggest failure was considered to be a failure of imagination. And so that's where this is where climate has this unassailable advantage over us. We cannot imagine the outrages it perpetrates. And in that respect, there's an analogy to the idea of the big lie, that you tell a story so outrageous, whether you're Donald Trump or previous dictators, and that people can't even conceive of how awful that could actually be. And then they actually do it. And then you're surprised. And I was listening to Heather Cox Richardson, the historian, talk about that. And I made the connection there when she was talking about that in relation to politics and autocrats, to climate change. And climate change, the things that it's doing are so outrageous that we just can't imagine it. And so that's a problem. But we've had the demonstrations now. And Fort McMurray, even in 2016, they'd seen Slave Lake, but they couldn't believe Slave Lake could happen to them, because Slave Lake's a little town of 7,500, but the embers don't care. The embers don't care how big you are. They'll fly a mile into your city. They'll burn your city down from behind you.
You reported this about the Vancouver fire, with embers landing blocks away, which easily could have started further fires, or your scenario coming from Stanley Park. And I think something that I saw in the Jasper coverage that is new and is very difficult politically is that really these fires can't be put out in a meaningful time frame. And in the day, firefighters in Jasper described titanic efforts they made just to save key architecture and watch the rest burn. This is not something that Canadians are used to. We always think we can put fires out. And
Yeah.
we just sent the Martin Mars bomber to a museum. And for people in the rest of the province, most people know that the Martin Mars is a 4-engine Second World War plane that took up a huge amount of water. And for year after year after year, people in trouble in the interior would say, well, where's the Martin Mars bomber? In other words, we just need a bigger fly swatter to kill all these flies, right? But what I think you're telling us is that that's not going to do the trick, and a different conversation is necessary.
I really think so, Geoff. And what firefighters in Fort McMurray learned, to their dismay was, they've got these really powerful hoses, that'll clear a room and, blow through a door. And this fire was so hot, 500 Celsius, it evaporated the water 100 meters before it got to the flames, and it actually ends up becoming more energy for the fire column because all that expanding steam goes up there and the thing's swirling anyway. I don't think this is understood yet, but I'm pretty sure all that water actually energizes the column. So on the other hand, I was imagining I'm living in, my leafy little West Side neighborhood here with the houses all 100 years old, made of kindling, packed in like sardines. And I'm thinking, well, if every one of us had a functioning sprinkler on our roof and embers were landing, and we knew, there was a dangerous fire over in Dunbar, 5 kilometers away, which there was a week ago. And if we then all got up on our roofs and put our sprinklers on, as the embers and ash start wafting over, we will improve our chances of making it through that fire by double-digit percentages. I would say 50 to 80% if everybody got on board with a home sprinkler system, which really is literally a garden sprinkler. It's not a fancy piece of apparatus. In fact, you don't need to raise taxes. You don't need to do anything. This is stuff that you can get at the hardware store and that most of us have anyway. And it's just a matter of deploying it in a different way. And you really, again, you're touching on that, Geoff and Kate both. It's this shift in consciousness. And Canadians are a bit, smug and self-satisfied in terms of the stability of their country. But we had 250,000 Canadians on the road last summer, displaced by fire.
Mm-hmm.
We had 250,000 refugees in our own country.
Maybe not able to go back for years as they're learning.
Who knows? They didn't know. And when you're evacuating Yellowknife and it's 1,500 kilometers to the nearest city with services, Fort Mac or Edmonton or someplace like that, think of what can happen to you on the road. What if you are someone with diabetes and you're 700 miles down the road, halfway to the next city with services, and you get a flat tire or you have a heart attack? Then you have this, a whole nother, or you have an accident, or there's another fire. I mean, there's 500,000 square mile area around Great Bear Lake right now that has probably 30 fires burning in it as we speak to each other right now.
When I started into provincial government, forest fire budgets were generally speaking contingency expenditures. You just didn't know, how could you tell? And they were never budget busters. If they were big, everyone went, oh, well, that was too bad. But since since 2017, when it really began to be an annual event, it's become baked in with more and more money. And after the last budget, I saw Premier Eby speak to a business audience and talk about standing up 1,000 new firefighters, training them, securing additional fire bombers, all that kind of stuff, or water bombers. But that's not. And then today, the polling shows that people think the government did a pretty good job on the evacuations, but it's the wrong measure, really. It's the fire prevention and management that's going to be the question down the road. And had they had a big problem, people would be furious.
Yeah, I think it was $1 billion for BC in the past year or so. And one lesson I think that's come out of Fort Mac is I do think there are more preemptive evacuations, but that they are incredibly disruptive. It's still better than being traumatized. It's still better than driving through flames and pitch black smoke with your kids in the back, not knowing if you're going to make it out. That no one should have to ever go through that. And that's literally what people in Gaza are going through, and the idea of having Canadians go through that in peacetime, is horrendous. And so a preemptive evacuation is a good thing to do, but and I think we need to develop our skills in enabling that and streamlining that at the same time that we look at how do we harden our communities. But also there's really three prongs. One is how you get people out safely and how you look after them when they're displaced, because that's going to be happening for the rest of our lives. Second, how do you harden our communities in ways that ordinary people can participate in, like with a garden sprinkler on the roof. But the elephant in the living room, the other elephant, is the petroleum industry. And most G7 countries are actively reducing their emissions. China apparently is right on the edge of hitting peak emissions. And it's very easy to point fingers, and Alberta comforts itself, Canadians comfort themselves saying, well, why should we do anything? Because China's not doing anything. Well, China is blowing everybody out of the water, and in terms of their laying on of renewable energy, and they are actively trying to move away from coal, even as they deal with the incredibly complex problem of a colossal population. And even Texas, oil central, conservative state central, pretty hostile to Washington. They've beat California in terms of the number of gigawatts of renewable energy they've put on in the past 5 or 10 years. And so if Texas can do it, anybody can. And they don't disavow oil. You can have both. And we're going to have both for a long time, but we have to shift the ratio, and we have to honestly connect the dots between our appetites, our behavior, our industry, and the incredible costs that are mounting weekly of climate change and the damage that does. It doesn't matter whether it's a worsening flood. Look at Montreal right now. Look at Vermont right now. That didn't used to happen. And then look at these fires. These are super expensive. And so to have the petroleum industry tell us, well, we need this energy, we need these jobs, is it really worth it? I think we can really ask that honestly and boldly and really compare the costs, the benefit of the bitumen industry versus the incredible costs of billion-dollar firefighting budgets and the costs of recovering from fire after fire, flood after flood, which are now baked in.
It's hard because I think a lot of how people understand their role in climate action is this, like, I can't afford it. Is this like, it's the carbon tax. It's me, I have to be this virtuous consumer. And sort of, we've really put that burden there. And I think we're going to talk later about some polling from some BC polling on what, voters' priority issues are. And spoiler alert, climate's not there. They're really worried about healthcare. They're really worried about being able to afford stuff as they go to the grocery store. They see climate policy as worsening that affordability of those groceries. And then I think you touched on this a bit when we were talking about other jurisdictions, but there's also this kind of like, well, shit, why is this on me? Like, China's not going to do it and we can't do it alone. So why am I going to be the sacrificial lamb on this issue?
Yeah. But that's false. Those are cynical politicians telling you untrue things. And when you really look clearly at what China is doing, it is colossal. And it puts Canada to shame. We're a wealthy G7 country with access to the best of everything. If any country is capable of decarbonizing, it is Canada. We are the richest country in the world when it comes to natural resources per capita. We have more sun, more solar, more water, more geothermal, more tidal energy potential than anybody else in the world. We could power the continent ourselves. And instead, you have the people basically whinging in ways that just reinforce the status quo and doom us to more fire and more flood, when we could be making these really positive changes. And, that is cynical and it's dishonest. And, look at what you spend on coffee or, other ridiculous things that most of us spend money on. And I'm not trying to dismiss the cost of living. It is real. I notice it too. but there are cynical folks who are drawing attention to particular costs at the expense of other costs. And I think we need to be more honest about what we're really paying for and where that money's really going. Look at the subsidies that we enable for the petroleum industry. Why shouldn't we should be subsidizing renewable energy? At least that has a future. Bitumen doesn't have a future. Alberta is consigning itself to being, the left behind in the 20th century, which has already been over for a quarter of a century. Look what Texas is doing. Texas is the best analogy because they're really like first cousins. Same side, really similar ambitions and roles in their respective countries. And yet Texas is moving into the 21st century with elan, I would say, even as backward as their policies may be on maternal health care or any number of other things.
Wasn't there something too where they've like divested of anyone who's made a climate commitment or something too? Like there's some it's sort of investment forward and then like climate change at the same time, somehow climate change denialism forward.
I mean, and that's where, I think both parties need to get over their need to own the other one, own in the negative sense. And, so when you call it inflation reduction, then we'll take your money and invest it in renewable energy. But if you called it a green energy fund, Texans would have none of it. And so, it's foolish and it's embarrassing to think that people are that shallow and that easily triggered by, various words when basically they're building out massive amounts of renewable energy infrastructure, which is the obvious way forward. And it's a shame we have to couch it in these kind of disguised infantilizing terms, I think. But and that's, it would be really nice, if we could have a more refreshingly honest conversation about all of this. And I appreciate you attempting to do that.
But you made an interesting comment in a different forum about the book and about Fort McMurray that I just want to repeat to you here and to get you to talk about it again, because you said when the evacuation call came, and you've commented on the fact there's something like 80 different languages spoken in Fort McMurray, a city of 60,000 plus, a late notice, but people were gathered up, as you put it, in the net of collective humanity and pulled to safety. Not a single person died in the flames. And that was 60,000 people in an afternoon, total chaos. So you talked to them, you interviewed them. They had all kinds of different takes on the fire, climate change, everything else. And yet when it really hit the fan, when it became cataclysmically desperate, humanity prevailed and everybody got to hug their kid the next day. I thought that was a really interesting takeaway and quite different from some of the conversations that we have generally about this, because that pointed to an optimistic view, really, that is hard to support when you look at what goes around, what's happening around us.
I mean, if that doesn't make you proud to be Canadian, I don't know what does. And again, show me another city in the past 50 years that's had a fire like that with a batting average like that. People died as a result of that fire, but nobody got burned up. Thank God. And that, Lahaina wasn't so lucky. Lytton wasn't so lucky. Paradise, Valparaiso, a bunch of places, and, that's a terrible way to die. And it's a terrible way to lose somebody. And the fact that we all got through that trauma without losing anybody in that way, is incredible. But it comes there again. There's a factor. There's a luck factor. A piece of the pie that we just can't control. But a whole bunch of people had incredibly difficult split-second decisions to make, and they all made more or less the right one. And that is amazing. And the fact that, again, you have all these different cultures who really have different concepts of what community might be, or what even a logical response to risk might be. And yet it all sort of coalesced, and that there was leadership there for sure. You know, the first responders absolutely saved a lot of lives. The bus service taking people who didn't have cars out, that saved a lot of lives. But most people saved their own lives. And I think, and that I agree with you. You know, it really makes me hopeful. But it's a shame that it has to come to a crisis to reveal that. But I think it still says that there is this decency and sanity as a kind of baseline in human beings. And I think, you know, that's where, you know, politics, media, social media in particular are trying to tweak that and manipulate that and skew that. And in ways that are really dangerous and unhelpful. And, you know, look at the situation in the States right now. Look at even what's going on in Canadian politics right now. And I don't think that's appealing to our true natures or our better natures. And that's I hope somebody goes back and studies properly that evacuation from Fort McMurray, because, you know, it's one for the record books. But I think it also reflects the country. It also reflects the kind of people who go to Fort McMurray and that spirit. And so there's a few different factors. And then, you know, I'd be curious to know how much was luck, but most of it wasn't luck. And that's the important part. That's the part we have control over.
Yeah. And that's a really excellent place to end. I think that theme that is pervasive in your book too, about the lessons we have to share with each other to keep us safe as these close calls become more frequent and more serious. So with that, we do have a lot of listeners too that are, I know, policymakers. So I think this was the right place to have this discussion. John Vaillant, it was a pleasure having you at Hotel Pacifico. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Kate and Geoff, I really enjoyed this conversation, more than I thought I would, in fact. So thanks. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, good.
And thanks to Mike also.
Yes, let's talk about speed, because it comes up a lot in politics, especially here in BC. For starters, with the Paris Games wrapping up, we're reminded we've got some speedy politicians, including Federal Minister and Delta MP Carla Qualtrough, who holds 2 Paralympic bronze medals for swimming. Provincially, we've got another fast Olympian in Minister Ravi Kahlon, who is almost as fast on the field hockey pitch as he is at churning out new housing legislation. When it comes to calling elections, we don't like to be too quick or hasty, and BC, unlike Quebec, doesn't call a lot of snap elections, though Premier John Horgan moved pretty fast to call one in 2020. One topic that elicits unanimous, multi-partisan support for speed is connectivity. And that's why hometown team TELUS is offering the fastest home internet speeds available in Western Canada. Through its new Pure Fiber 5 gigabit internet service, TELUS is bringing upload speeds of up to 5 gigabits per second to BC, significantly enhancing the online experience for activities such as streaming, gaming, and remote work. This launch is part of TELUS's ongoing commitment to investing in advanced technology and infrastructure to meet the growing digital needs of its customers, which is just the right speed for BC's hometown team and for all of us.
Hello. You've reached the Hotel Pacifico Strategy Suite.
Mike's back from Bell shopping. Good to see you, Mike.
Ding, 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 ding.
Still using that analog technology.
That's a oldie but a goodie.
Yeah.
It is a goodie. I mean, the sound effects do add a little extra. I enjoy them. Speaking of little extra, we had a shout out this week from Von Palmer.
Yeah, for Cafe Pacifico.
Whoops. Oh, I mean,
They kindly changed it at the desk.
There's no cafe?
They there's
a cafe within Hotel Pacifico.
within the
Didn't
hotel.
you know?
Where
It sells cortados.
Juan didn't realize how big we were. We were actually a hotel cafe nestled inside a hotel.
Mhm.
Yeah. Very awesome. Yeah. So he was picking up on Angus Reid's comments. I think his kind of predictions of, that you can't take to Vegas.
A lot of great
60%?
feedback on the Angus Reid episode.
Yeah.
A lot of people sending me notes saying, "Hey, that was a good one." And I noticed from our YouTube, lots of comments on the YouTube channel and lots of views too. So thank you,
great.
Angus.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
very good.
Angus. Yeah,
Lots
that
of
was a
feedback.
fun one. That was a fun one. All right. Well, we're picking up on something we started last week, right? And delving into some of these, some of the nominations and going a bit deep on some ridings. The one I want to start with today is Saanich North in the Islands. So this is where Adam Olsen is stepping down. He's held that pretty tightly since 2017, but I think pre that riding, and I'll take it to you, Geoff, because I think it's got Pender Island is included in there, is it not? Your
It
other
is.
home.
In
Yeah.
fact, the candidate nominated is apparently a neighbor here on Pender Island, where I spent some time in the summer.
The NDP candidate or the Green candidate?
The Green candidate. And I have not been able to identify an NDP candidate, which is odd
I
because
don't think they've nominated yet. Yeah.
they've nominated almost everywhere else. But this was an NDP riding before Adam held it, held by Gary Holman of Salt Spring Island.
For one term.
But for one
For
term,
one term.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
A narrow win, he hung on, but then Adam defeated him. And Adams was a very strong constituency person. And you could see signs of that everywhere in the riding. But there was a runoff between Rob Botterill, who's a former public servant and environmentalist, against Stuart McKinnon, who was a Green Party park board trustee or commissioner in Vancouver before he retired and moved to Saanich. So they didn't release a vote, but Rob Botterill was successful. And this is the only case I can think of where there was a fight for the nomination, because it's a winnable seat for the Green Party.
It's a winnable seat, but how winnable? Because I think, so pre-Adam Olsen, it was kind of a three-way race, right? And then I think just broadly, the Greens are not polling very strongly right now. And we say Green, like Adam Olsen definitely was a brand. And then federally, it's held by Elizabeth May, who again, right? Like these are kind of big
Correct.
names. Is this going to be hard for Rob to take for the Greens?
Well, if you go back to 2013, well, first of all, the BC Liberals held this seat from 1991 to 2013. 2013 or 2017? 2013, I think. 2013.
Okay.
And one of my political mentors, Clive Tanner, won it from Mel Couvelier in 91, and from 96 to 2013, Murray Cole had it. Murray retired, and there was a real three-way race, and from first to third was a 400 votes separated first to third.
Yeah.
So Gary Holman from the NDP just edged out Adam Olsen, who was third, and Stephen Roberts, BC Liberal, who was second. Then Adam Olsen won it quite handily the next time and the next time. So Adam Olsen lost once before, he won twice. And you're right, Adam developed into a brand unto himself, in my opinion. He had some unique qualities there that translated well. Plus, Elizabeth May representing the federal seat, I think, was a huge plus for Adam Olsen in terms of the validation of the Green brand in the riding. But this time, I'd keep my eye on the conservative David Bush, who's a two-time federal conservative candidate, lost to Elizabeth May twice. He's out there running, and he's got some name recognition. And, I go back to that, 22 years of BC Liberals representing that riding. There's a base there. So watch out.
That'll be an interesting one to watch. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, we've talked before about how Green Party voters are not necessarily left-wing, although they're often tagged that way, and certainly under Andrew Weaver, although he is not notably left-wing. There was a left-wing tone to the work they did in the CASA program. They agreed with the NDP that was under John Horgan, was more in that vein, but I don't know that that's always the case, and it'll be hard for Rob Botterill, regardless of his personal qualities, to raise the profile enough, I think, to hang on to it. There's certainly a lot of very solid conservative and centrist voters in that riding, and it'll be a challenge for Rob, I think. But the NDP has not got much of a chance with a candidate, so we'll see what comes up there.
Well, should we read anything into the fact that there isn't someone there?
I'm
For the
sure you
NDP?
could read a lot of frustration into the mind of the party activists in Vancouver looking for somebody.
Yeah.
They could be waiting on someone.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Because that could be an interesting factor. I mean, again, and I was going to say, like, to exactly your point, Geoff, about your temptation to say that these are progressive voters. I mean, the data we're seeing are definitely saying that the Greens are bleeding to the Conservatives, not to the NDP. So the other factor that will determine that one. Okay, well, let's head east. Let's talk about Kelowna Mission, which I feel like, Mike, your spidey senses rumor mill has been tingling because of that riding a bit lately.
Well, first of all, the Conservatives bounced a candidate. I can't remember her name. Alexandra Wright, maybe. And I don't really know the story why she got bounced, but it's a pretty juicy riding presenting itself for a potential Conservative candidate because it's right in the heart of the Okanagan. BC United will argue that they're doing really well still in Kelowna. Polls would indicate otherwise. But if you're a potential Conservative candidate, it's like, Kelowna, interesting. They're also, Vernon is also an open seat for the Conservatives. And there is a strong BC United candidate there. And there's an incumbent NDP MLA. So there's some chess pieces on the board that are yet to be played. Jazz Joe Hall last Friday, I believe, passed along some speculation via Twitter or X that BC Conservatives are trying to recruit Gavin Dew, who is a former BC United leadership candidate and well known within the BC Liberal / BC United circles as a very active party organizer and former candidate in Mount Pleasant by-election. And in my opinion, if the Conservatives are successful in attracting Gavin to run for them, that would be a big plus for them. Gavin's younger. He's politically connected guy who's got a real joy for politics. I'll put it that way.
But doesn't he live in Chilliwack or Abbotsford?
No, he lives in Kelowna, actually. He does live
He
in
lives in
Kelowna.
Kelowna, okay.
Yeah, they relocated, he and his wife, Erin Shum, who used to be on Vancouver Park Board, relocated there a while ago. Gavin's everywhere. He's works in Abbotsford. He lives in Kelowna. I don't know. He's everywhere. Anyways, I've known him for a long time. I just think he's the type of guy that if you are building a party on the fly, what the Conservatives are doing, he is the type of person that can be very useful because he just networks all over the place. So watch that. And let's see if Gavin emerges. If Gavin does become a Conservative candidate, then that's yet another, I would say, fairly prominent switcheroo going on from BC United over to the Conservatives.
All right. Well, let's go ahead.
I saw an interview with perennial right of center rainmaker Norman Stowe saying, he was supporting the Conservatives, and why wouldn't he under the circumstances? So it's becoming normalized to support the Conservatives over BC United, which has got to be a further aggravation for Kevin Falcon.
Well,
and Norm Stowe was a very, very strong Kevin Falcon supporter in the previous leadership campaigns.
Yep.
All right. Speaking of aggravation, the polls have reasons to aggravate a lot of people, and we have a latest poll out from Leger that declares the cushy lead that the EB government enjoyed as recently as March has evaporated and identifies 5 factors that put the heat on. 1, growing awareness of and support of John Rustad, Conservative leader John Rustad. 2, consensus BC is on the wrong track. 3, the popularity of the federal Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre. 4, some self-inflicted wounds on the handling of key files. And 5, the implosion of BC United. I think there's a lot to pick apart there, but I think certainly, and I'll just say the numbers too, right? It's got a top line, NDP 41, BC Conservatives 38, BC United at 10, and the Greens at 8. In particular, we're now in a context where, 38 for the Conservatives, 41 for NDP, that is not a lot of wiggle room. And I feel like we're seeing the EB government maybe behaving and handling some of the files as though they have more wiggle room than they do. Can I put it that way? They've been a little slow to wrestle some issues to the ground, Mike. I think you've been picking up on some of these recently and noticing they've got to move more quickly.
Yeah, I'll just put an asterisk on the poll result.
Okay.
The NDP are still winning with 55 plus voters like Jeff and I, and they our age group, not necessarily our voting intention, but that's a turnout advantage normally.
Right.
Older people are more likely to vote, so that 3 points might be 4 or 5 points. So just a little detail there for everybody.
Pollster nerd moment though. Hold on, Mike.
Yeah,
Can I just,
sure.
Is it typical? Because I saw that gender wasn't a big factor, and then age was. I feel like I'm more used to seeing gender be similar to age.
I thought gender was still a bit of a factor. I mean, women are more likely to vote NDP than men usually.
I'll look it up.
I'll have to take a closer look at it.
Yeah.
The other detail in this poll, which is we've talked about this in previous episodes, is this is an online poll from an online panel. different than the IVR automated poll. And the IVRs were out ahead saying the race is very close or it's tied. And the online was lagging 10 points on that. And now the online's up to both this one and Mario Canseco's research co-poll are 3 points. So the online's there now as well, that it's a very, very tight race. So, you know, hey, still lots of politics to be played, you know, it's still, you know, 5 weeks
the
away from the
asterisk,
election, anything could happen. But
Well, the asterisk I would put on is that Evie's approval ratings remain ahead of the party, but also the party's general support has only dropped a few points. It's the elevator rising at the expense of Kevin Falcon, the conservative elevator rising. That's the big change. And it's at the point now, and I think Angus Reid pointed to this last week, where undoubtedly there are massive efforts being made once more to drive Kevin Falcon out of the race completely and consolidate the center-right vote. You know, there's a whole bunch of other factors here, but what's interesting to me is that some contradictions in the Leger polling, which I don't think, I think two things can be true at the same time. So I'm not challenging the polling, but you know, as Mike said, older voters tend to support the NDP more right now. Younger voters are strangely supporting the Conservatives, but are less likely to vote. At the same time, younger
why do you
voters.
find that strange?
Well, I find it strange that younger voters are more likely to support the Conservatives, and maybe I need to check my thinking on that.
Well, they're doing that with Polyev, right?
Well,
So,
and they're
yeah,
well, and
but
they're
that's important. Why is, you know, you would think that that's not the case, but they are because of the affordability issues. Just
yes,
before
and
you start
housing and housing. Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense to me either. No, like when you started saying like it's hard to pull apart some of it, I had the same reaction. Like I'm looking at it and it's really, there's a lot to pull apart in the fact that the older voters are skewing to the NDP. And then you look at the issues voters care about and it just mystifies it more, because the NDP, I could see like older voters being bothered by what the NDP are doing on housing, right? And then the young, but I don't understand it. I mean, related to that in the sort of critique of the government, how the government's performance, right? It was interesting because the poll gave back that voters disapprove of the government's handling of transportation and like relations with the federal government. Like I was like, that's the thing that I don't understand.
I don't think it's, I don't think it's that.
Well, yeah, right. And there's more.
You know, like, when is this government going to put some issues to bed here? Like,
Yeah.
they just new ones, they put one to bed and another one pops up. And this
Whack-a-mole.
Kitsilano housing development thing with, you know, the housing hub stuff was been in the news, and that's been a bit of a problematic. But the other one is just popping up like overnight, last 24 hours, it seems, is putting those with profound addiction issues in long-term care settings. And there's some media on that, and some really, like in Northern Beat, Fran Yanner wrote a piece of a first-hand testimony of a nurse, which is, you know, her perspective, but it's like, whoa, you know, like that's tough stuff in terms of what's actually happening. So I haven't seen if that's been contested or not, but those are the types of issues that I could see could be quite visceral with voters, you know, if they really get a lot of oxygen.
Well, I mentioned the tree fruit co-op last week, which continued for quite a while. It's still not over really, because there's still further coverage of it. The problem there is to be able to turn around and say, well, we actually were able to get everybody's crop to market. And I don't know if they're going to be able to say that or not. You know, the housing one is very tough because the issue there was, well, wait a minute. We experienced this on Vancouver City Council. You know, within the margins that you had, you wanted to encourage rental housing because over time it's much more affordable. It's got some soft rent controls here in BC, and it tends to be something that people can get into without a down payment, without having to qualify for a mortgage, all that kind of stuff. But that's policy talk. It doesn't really impress people when they see that something that's had some assistance from the government is still at a market rent, even if 14 of the units in that building, which has 54 or something, are going to be 14 are going to be quite affordable. People are going to focus on the ones that are not affordable. And I think Ravi Kalan's done as good a job as you could trying to explain that. But usually when you're explaining in politics, you're losing. And so people hold up this example and say, well, you know, what a disaster. I can't afford to live there. But in fact, it's dramatically increased the rental stock, which in a policy, from a policy perspective, is a good thing.
Well, so meanwhile, over at BC United, I think, Mike, they're doing some of their own polling?
Well, they're doing some policy and some polling. On the policy front, just coming out today, Kevin Falcon's made he put his chips on the table to take $5.4 billion of revenue and give it back to the people, which would be raising the basic exemption on income tax from about $12,000 to about $50,000, which according to their materials would mean 60% of British Columbians would not pay provincial income tax, still pay federal, but wouldn't pay provincial. And that would be a maximum savings of about $2,000 for people. So they give an example of a $35,000 a year minimum wage worker would save over $1,000 in taxes. So for those people, that would be a significant savings. For the hole that it would blow in the budget, $5.4 billion, BC United cheerily and breezily says it will pay for itself due to
Fantastic.
increased economic activity. Now, look,
Why don't we just get rid
there's
of
some
taxes
truth to
altogether?
that. There's
So,
some truth
yeah.
to that. It will create some more consumer spending and will help ease affordability concerns. And there was similar to an argument Gordon Campbell used in 2001, a 25% cut in the income tax rate. They said it would pay for itself.
Did
And
it?
lo and behold, the budget did balance by about 2005. The economists
Not
made
without a
different.
ton of pain. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
this is philosophically though a pretty big departure for Kevin Falcon, because as finance
Yeah.
minister, it was a very much under Christy Clark. It was very much balance the budget. Take careful steps as you give tax relief, make sure everything's working. So they're swinging for the fences here. Maybe taking a calculated view that people just aren't as fussed about balanced budgets as they are about affordability, but we are also currently have a deficit under the NDP of about $8 billion. So I don't know. I mean, Wilkinson tried this last election with the PST cut, right? And it kind of fell flat.
Well, Leslie shows that people aren't that worried about taxes. They're much more worried about healthcare. They're more worried about housing and affordability. When EB ran that big deficit, there was some taps on the wrist from rating agencies, but not the chaos that might have erupted 20 years ago. I don't think that that the EB government could continue on that path indefinitely. They're going to have to find guardrails at some point that show a forward plan. But right now, there doesn't seem to be an electoral price to pay, and the tax cut just seems so big to me as to be laughable. I mean, it's not targeted. It's not aimed at people who can afford to pay. There's no strategy here except to blow a $5 billion hole in the books.
Well,
I think it's aimed at the bottom rung, Jeff. I mean, everybody receives it, but it's proportionally going to be more impactful to lower income.
and I always assume when I read polling on affordability that taxes are closely related to that. I think in the minds of most voters, taxes are related to affordability.
Well, maybe, but people like the services, and I think when you make a statement that requires obviously a huge amount of service reduction if you're going to make it work, then you're gonna be in waters that people don't want to be in. But I agree, they're throwing anything they can against the wall, and they're going to see how it works. But it'll be very interesting to see how Falcon comes out after Labor Day, unless he suddenly packs it in and changes his mind about everything in the next few days, which doesn't seem likely. But I think I'm sure the not NDP forces, which are still there, of course, in BC in a big way, are working night and day to try to make sure he does drop out and can completely consolidate that right side that we've seen getting stronger and stronger under Rustad.
Well, I mean, it's one thing if Kevin Falcon dropped out. If they replace him with another leader, it may not change the reality whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
It's really what they really would need if they wanted to pursue that strategy is for BC United candidates to either be absorbed in some cases by the Conservatives, which is there's not many openings left for that, or they drop out because you actually just physically have to get the United candidates off the ballot at this point. Or sorry, BC United parentheses formerly BC Liberal Party.
Right.
Can I ask you about that, Mike? Because the fact that so that's official now, they're going to get
Apparently,
that.
yeah.
Well, like, so would they have some insight that that's actually going to help? Like, why are...
I think the train has left the station on this
Well, then why
Like,
did they bother?
I,
They must.
there's a lot of churn at BC United headquarters.
Mm.
Some strategists have left, new strategists have arrived. I can't speak to the
Someone thought it would
decision-making
work.
processes that are happening there or how fast they're moving on these issues. There is in the past week, they scored a goal in their own net by releasing a poll and excitedly extolling the virtues of it to their email list, and then having that poll smacked down for its lack of credibility. And, it just strikes me that it's not solid. They're,
They're unsteady.
they're
Yeah.
very unsteady right now. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a tough time. All right. Well, real quick, actually, I'll bring it to you, Geoff, because BC United's deeply unsteady. The trajectory for the Conservatives seems quite positive and has some serious velocity. Sorry. If you were running the NDP right now, Geoff, would there be any part of you that'd be like, call it now, call it now? We don't want to wait till September.
Oh, sure. I guess you could, but Eby's always said he will never do that. And at this stage, it's pretty hard to recalibrate all that kind of thing because it's just like 10 weeks away, less than that. I mean, if the premier was, I think, on a little bit of a final rest, but got out again this week and is now in the Kootenays doing a few things, and we'll see what they do next. But I think if they have the time and the energy, which they should find, they should take a look around at all of the groups out there that have traditionally supported the NDP who may have issues that they'd like to hear some reassurance on outside the major platform, either an announcement or whatever, and do those things. Speak to various constituencies, not in a broad brush way, but very specifically about what they're going to do about childcare, whether there's certain things they need to say to the labor movement, who they normally have we've always had a strong relationship with. Are there other areas like that where they can make policy initiatives that would be supportive generally, but also very appreciated locally? You look at the Doug Ford group in Ontario, for example, gave I think a couple $100 million to the building trades for training programs. I don't think anybody in the public would object to that. A similar kind of action here would be very well received in the labor movement, but also I think the public would like it. So maybe that's all hanging fire for after Labor Day, but those are the sorts of discussions they should be having. I'm sure they are, with as many people as possible right now.
Well, some little free
Make them
advice.
feel good.
I kind of
Make
think
people
there's a
feel good.
little bit of chatter within the NDP, though, that, geez, he should have called this last year.
Oh yeah, but whatever. Right now, everybody has to focus on the date that's there, and they're all locked down to it. So there's some, maybe armchair quarterbacking happening on the front.
Mike
But I think part of the question is, how does he come out of the out of the gate? Right after Labor Day, with the energy and drive to consolidate that vote, because right now it looks like it'll be closer to a traditional split that we've seen in the past number of years. 37 to 43%.
Well,
on both sides.
It's obviously not unlike sports in terms of all the intangibles that go into winning and losing, and confidence is a big part of it. So while I think NDPers can feel like they've got a very good chance of winning this election, they haven't exactly been on a big winning streak this year and going into the playoffs, if I can put it that way. Whereas you got this team that's come right out of the blue and is full of confidence and swagger right now, and that being the Conservatives. So the trajectory of both would be a concern for me if I were sitting in the Orange headquarters.
Well, and it certainly helps. You're doing a great job, Mike, of sowing discontent within the ranks of the NDP machinery. Make them resentful for that.
I'm a modest podcaster.
Well done, sir. In case anybody's listening. All right, let's grab a drink.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
Yeah, I've got a shot and a raised glass this week. I'm going to go back to that poll that BC United put out. It was really dumb. And what they did is they had a polling firm. I'll use that loosely because I don't believe they're actually a firm. In fact, you go on their website, you can't even find any who's who on it. My understanding, it's an outfit that's very associated with the current regime of BC United. And they put out a survey which was laughably, not credible in terms of their sample, the geography of the sample, the age composition of the sample, many questions raised, all to make the point that they were gaining support and the NDP and the Conservatives were losing support, and that even with that, they were still in a distant third, and even with that, you look at some of the regional breaks they did provide, like in Lower Mainland, and they're would be absolutely decimated. So, they trumpeted this poll because it got put on 338 Canada's polling register of web polls that are on the website. They subsequently took it off because of all the questions raised by it. So now they got their email out. Maybe they raised a couple $1,000 on it. Who knows? But to me, the credibility of that campaign team pursuing that strategy, it may be total inside the Beltway and may only be about 200 people who even noticed this whole, well, more now since our podcast listeners are here, that paid attention to it. But to me, it was not a good sign for that campaign that approach was used. So I'm taking a shot at the campaign team for BC United. I said, you guys, you gotta, that's sloppy. And that's the position you're in. I get that you have to throw things at the wall, but you got to be a little more careful than that, in my opinion. I'm going to raise a glass. I'm here today, taking a break from my little trip to Tofino, and I'm going to raise a glass to Tofino. And I'll raise a glass to Josie Osborne, who was the mayor of Tofino. It's a nice little town here, and Mayor Osborne likely did a good little job. Keep tending to the village, which I really like. Lots of great small businesses, notwithstanding the fantastic beaches that are here. It's a great little town. So way to go, Tofino.
Here, here.
Here, here.
Well, I'll raise a glass to Pete Fry, who's a Green Party councillor in the city of Vancouver, because I try to stay away from civic politics on this show, but it's been a big story for the last week and a half or so, while the mayor seeks to rid himself of an integrity commissioner who was appointed under the previous administration, who bats away as many complaints as she actually adjudicates. But the mayor thought it was wise, apparently, to shut her down for a while for reasons that would take too long to explain. And Pete Fry was able to, they even called a special meeting in the summer break to get this job done, and then had to postpone the whole thing till September. And Pete Fry, who was caught on vacation in Nova Scotia during this, was able to work out a strategy which a few loose ends, but was certainly important in getting the council to, or the mayor to retreat and push that over to September. So good work by him, raising a lot of questions both on social media and in the media that I think the mayor was unable to answer. And in fact, the mayor lost another member of his ABC team who quit over this whole episode. So it's a much smaller example of what's happening to BCU in some respects. BC United, the ABC brand, which looked so indomitable 2 years ago, had two of its members not even show up for the special meeting, and a school board commissioner quit over it. Lots of problems there. But good work, Pete Fry.
Yeah, I've caught a couple of his interviews on the subject, and I thought he's been quite strong. All right. I will raise a glass, and I will raise a glass to Alberta Central Chief Economist Charles St. Arnaud, who has coined a new term, the me session. I'm raising this glass because I think you both and our listeners have heard me worry that we no longer have the right metrics, the right tools, the right nomenclature to discuss the state of our economy. And the me session, don't know if the term will stick, but gets at that problem. And it's what he's coined there is the fact that we are not technically in a recession, which means GDP shrinking in 2 quarters successively. But we would be if you took out the growth that came from adding in people. People actually are spending less. And if you just look at the people who are already here, we would be in a recession. So he's renaming this, and calling it a me session, in that the consumer spending of the folks who are already here is down. And just to say, again, I'll keep it tight, but and this is what we see in the problem around housing and all the sort of spending that doesn't go on behind the people we bring in, because we use them to mask other economic indicators and do other good things. I don't want to be too facile about it, but this is the mini bar. We keep it tight. So hopefully next time we have an economist on, we can go deeper on this one. But I'm really grateful to Alberta Central's chief economist for looking for some new names for that. All right.
Good.
That wraps us up for another epic, long, big episode of Hotel Pacifico. I want to thank our guest, John Vaillant, for joining us today, and our presenting sponsor, TELUS. We will see you next week, guests. BC, you can never leave.
Checkout time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.